Desiring to be a Corvette killer, this subsidiary under General Motors was handed a box of scraps, and out of those scraps, they built one of the most underrated muscle cars ever. The Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. It's 1964. Ford has launched the Ford Mustang and the Mercury Cougar, two-door sports car muscle cars that are taking the world by storm. Meanwhile, Chevrolet has turned their Corvette into a fantastic-looking V8-powered sports car, worthy of all the European competition. And Pontiac was kind of just left there twiddling their thumbs. So, the head of Pontiac, John DeLorean, ordered his engineers to make a concept. They called it the Banshee. It was a two-door sports car that had the same power as a Corvette, but it weighed 500 pounds less. And it looked good. It looked really good. And when GM executives heard about this brand new sports car, they killed it. They axed it because they didn't want to cancel out the Corvette sales. And in the ultimate twist of irony, GM took the Banshee concept and turned it into the Corvette C3. That's gotta sting. But in consolidation, GM gave DeLorean the F-body platform and a new share of the pony car market. 3 years later, in 1967, the first generation Pontiac Firebird debuts. And there were quite a few engine options, if I'm honest. There were two inline sixes that were fuel efficient but made 165 horsepower, but we don't care about those. We're here for the 3 V8s, a 326 cubic inch, making 250 horsepower, a 350 cubic inch, making 285 horsepower, or the big boy on the block, the 400 cubic inch V8, making 325 horsepower. And a handling package was also available to make it a bit better around the corners for the low price of $1,100 additional price. And in 1969, the final year of the first generation, they launched a revised 6.6-liter V8 engine option with an optional Ram Air 4 intake. That bumped power up to 345 horsepower and 440 foot-pounds of torque. That was good for 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds in 1969. And to be honest, those numbers probably aren't even accurate, but we aren't 100% sure. That's all they listed in the brochure, and we all know how inaccurate American brochures were in the 60s. I should say something about the name of the Trans Am now that we have finished it up. You see, the reason it was called the Trans Am in the first place is Pontiac planned to compete in the SCCA Trans Am series, but they forgot to read the rule book because the smallest engine available, V8 engine option anyway, on the Firebird was too big for regulations in the SCCA, which had a 5-liter max capacity limit, and they weren't exactly in favor of the SCCA, or a lot of the SCCA was not in favor of them, because GM used the Trans Am name without license, and SCCA sued GM for copyright violation, and won, and they had to pay over $13 million to them over the course of the Firebird production. And that's in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s money. That is quite expensive. Now, the second generation got off to a bit of a rocky start, shall we say. They had some manufacturing delays and issues, which meant the second generation, which was launched with a full refresh, was delayed by about 6 months. But the 6.6-liter engine now made 370 horsepower. And there was a new engine, because 6.6-liter wasn't good enough. So, in 1971, they gave us a 335 horsepower, 7.5-liter Pontiac in-house V8. That's insane. Unfortunately, there was a GA workers' strike in 1972, which almost ended all F-body production of the Pontiac Firebird and the Chevy Camaro. But it survived that just in time for 1974 with new emission regulations and an oil crisis. Now, that was a bigger issue than you might realize. You see, Pontiac advertised the 1974 Firebird with 310 horsepower and 390 torque. One issue: the 455 cubic inch engines they were using weren't really meeting emission regulations. And the advertised cars that were sent out for testing had to be labeled as non-passing pre-production versions. And they had to redesign, or rework, the entire Firebird lineup to meet emission regulations, which meant a reduced compression ratio and a lower power figure of 290 horsepower. But it did at least set the fastest quarter mile time at 14.3 seconds. But hey, the performance may have been getting worse, but it didn't matter because it had one tool: celebrity backing. From 1974 to 1980, the hit TV show The Rockford Files, you know, the one that popularized the J-turn, aka the Rockford turn, used a Pontiac Firebird as their star car for their main protagonist. And then we get to this small, low-budget B film called Smokey and the Bandit, which had a gold and black Pontiac Firebird Trans Am prominently featured as one of the film's main stars alongside Burt Reynolds and Sally Fields. And you know what? Sure, it only had 177 horsepower, and sure, all but one of the cars was destroyed in filming, but sales doubled after it. Which is good, because they needed strong sales, because in 1980, Pontiac dropped all large capacity engines because of emission issues. And that meant the biggest engine available was a 301 cubic inch V8, which is not bad, if I'm honest. And sure, it was half the size, a little over that, of the previous engines, but it had a trick up its sleeve. A brand new technology pioneered by Saab called the turbocharger. Unfortunately, the carburetor system was still a bit old, and the turbocharger couldn't effectively be utilized. And the low-octane fuels of the 80s meant that there was a slight chance of engine detonation. I'm not an expert. However, if your engine has a slight chance of exploding because of a low fuel mixture, that's a bad engine. So Pontiac had to install a brand new ECU and other tweaks to make sure the engines didn't explode, which meant the power was way down despite the new turbocharger. Despite all these little niggles, the Firebird continued on in the third generation in 1982, and I'll be honest, it was lacking some speed. By 1985, some base models made a whopping 88 horsepower from the factory. And the third gen decided to remedy this lack of power by looks. They did a full redesign with a new wedge-shaped body, not only to increase fuel efficiency by aerodynamics, but to also improve performance. A wind tunnel was used for the first time in Firebird history to develop a fully functional rear spoiler. They also redesigned the F-body chassis to improve handling and save 500 pounds of weight. And they introduced a new GTA edition. Not the video game GTA. That featured a 350 cubic inch V8, 230 horsepower, which is not bad for 1987 from America. And if you wanted your Firebird to look like a Fiero for some reason, you could have an $800 notchback limited edition option, I guess. But the interesting thing about the third gen is that its most powerful, fastest version was not a V8. You see, Buick had been working on this thing called the Grand National, and they had tuned up this crummy little V6 into a turbocharged monster. And they threw that 3.8 liter V6 into the Firebird 20th Anniversary Edition. That meant 250 horsepower and 340 foot-pounds of torque. And that also meant a 0 to 60 time of just 5.5 seconds, which is very good. It was one of the fastest American cars in the world at the time. It continued to have celebrity backings. It was Knight Rider, driven by David Hasselhoff, and Dwight Schrute in The Office. I mean, we got Dwight Schrute and David Hasselhoff. What more can you want? Success and turbocharging that got more and more efficient, and the continued celebrity endorsement helped the Firebird soldier on into the fourth generation in 1993. The body kept its wedge shape, but it got more curvy. And for a while anyway, the only engine option was a 200 horsepower V6, which is meh. But then an LS1 V8 was offered, making 285 horsepower, and just one optional extra bumped that up to 305, the first Trans Am with more than 300 horsepower in 30 years. And after a quick refresh in 1998 that tweaked the styling, a new engine was introduced that was darn near identical to the LS1 from the C5 Corvette. This was now getting to be a proper muscle car once again. It also had a new electronic braking system, and the cassette player was removed in 2002. Now we're in the 21st century. But let's be honest here. We're only here to talk about one thing. If you want the top tip of the Firebird lineup in the 90s, you had to get the Firehawk. This was a limited run, top of the line Firebird made by SLP Engineering, first used in 1991. It had 350 horsepower, could do 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, and did the quarter mile in 13.2. Oh, one issue though. If you wanted it, you had to spend $33,000 on top of the base model Firebird price to get it, and that's 1990s money. It was a bit pricey. And only 25 were made because of this, and SLP nearly went into bankruptcy. So in 2002, they brought the Firehawk name back, lowered the price, and detuned it to a mere 335 horsepower. And that was still good for a 13.6 second quarter mile and a top speed of in excess of 165 miles an hour. Sadly though, these could not save the Firebird, and it was discontinued in 2002. And in fact, all of Pontiac was gone just 7 years later. But have no doubt the Firebird name is not completely dead yet, because recently a outside firm has been working with GM to make a Camaro into a Firebird-esque thing. It's like a modification system. Oh, and it makes near enough makes no difference 1,000 horsepower. Yeah, can you imagine having that in Smokey and the Bandit? Those cops wouldn't have stood a hope in hell. The Firebird may have been a bit of an ugly duckling in the muscle car wars. It never had the same performance as the Camaro or the Challenger. It never had the success, the brand value of the Mustang. But it was one of the best Pontiacs ever made, and sure, from 1970 to 2000, it wasn't really all that great most of the time, but it starred in some of the greatest automotive films of all time, and that alone deserves its legacy in the history books.